I still remember the taste of that morning's coffee. Bitter, burnt, and strangely prophetic. It was the kind of day when the air feels heavy, like something in the universe is about to shift. I didn't know it then, but by noon, the entire foundation of our $650 million merger would be in flames, and I'd be the spark. The message came through while I was finalizing the last legal report for the board. Just a single email. No greeting, no context. Just 4 words that would ignite everything that followed. Bonus request not approved. I stared at it for a long time. Not because of the denial itself, but because of what it represented. Months of 12-hour days, drafting compliance documentation for the merger, managing NDAs, coordinating audits, and yet, the executives decided my work wasn't worth a line in their budget. They called it standard policy adjustments. I called it what it really was. Reed wearing a suit. At that point I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the eye of a storm. I forwarded the email to myself, printed it, and slipped it into the folder marked Final Merger Checklist. It wasn't a dramatic move, more like muscle memory. In my department, paper trails were power. Every signature, every timestamp, every digital footprint told a story. And this one, though small, was a story of arrogance. The kind that eventually eats itself alive. The clock on my monitor blinked. 9:43 a.m., the merger, signing was scheduled. For noon, a historic moment that would merge 2 manufacturing giants under one roof. Every document I'd prepared had been triple-checked, every clause airtight. Or so they thought. Because buried deep within the compliance section, hidden, behind pages of tax waivers and liability exemptions, was a clause that I had written myself. A clause that nobody noticed, one that I inserted 3 months ago, when I realized just how carelessly they treated the very people who built their empire. It wasn't malicious then. It was a safeguard, a silent alarm system to ensure no executive could override protocol without full employee acknowledgement. But that morning, when they denied my bonus, it became something else entirely. A weapon of consequence. I sat in the meeting room as the board members began to arrive. Polished smiles, expensive suits, the scent of confidence mixed with entitlement. They spoke about legacy, synergy, growth, all the empty corporate poetry they used to mask their greed. I nodded, took notes, and waited. My pulse stayed steady, my expression unreadable. The CEO, Mr. Barrington, stood by the glass window overlooking the city skyline. By noon, he said, we'll be unstoppable. I smiled faintly. By noon, I whispered, you'll be history. The signing began at exactly 11:47. Dozens of eyes on screens, lawyers verifying clauses, assistants shuffling papers. I watched their pens move, one after another, binding billions in signatures. And then, at 11:58, the system froze. First it was a flicker, then a full stop. The merger verification portal, the one connected to the international compliance database, crashed. A red warning message blinked across the screen. Invalid authorization detected. Clause 17B breach. Immediate audit initiated. Silence. Absolute deafening silence. Within minutes, their phones started buzzing. Legal teams scrambled. The room that had been full of power just moments ago now smelled of panic. The merger was officially halted pending investigation by the very clause they had ignored. The one I had built. The one they never paid attention to. As chaos unfolded, I calmly closed my laptop. No one looked at me. They were too busy trying to explain to federal regulators why their billion-dollar merger had triggered an automatic compliance lockdown. And in that moment, as the realization spread like wildfire, I finally felt something unexpected. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but an eerie calm, because they hadn't just denied my bonus. They had denied my worth, and that came with a cost far greater than any number on a paycheck. By noon, their empire began to crumble, and I hadn't even left my seat. Before that day unraveled into chaos, I was just another name buried deep in the compliance department, invisible, efficient and indispensable only when things went wrong. My title sounded impressive enough, senior corporate auditor, but in truth it meant I was the one quietly cleaning up the messes, created by executives who never read what they signed. For years I'd watched them make deals over champagne while I was left auditing their shortcuts, their hidden loopholes, their quiet conflicts of interest. Every time I found something questionable, it was brushed under a polite phrase, "We'll handle it internally." And internally usually meant ignore it, bury it, pretend it never happened. I learned early on that in corporate politics, silence was a currency, but knowledge, that was the weapon. When the merger talks began 8 months ago, I became the unseen architect of its integrity. I was responsible for creating a system that ensured neither company could manipulate the numbers during integration. Every signature, every transaction, every asset transfer had to pass through my compliance network. It was digital, yes, but layered, with physical checkpoints that required acknowledgement from every key department. That's when the idea for Clause 17B was born. It started as a safeguard, a fail-safe I embedded deep within the merger protocol. It stated that any modification or override to the merger's approval system, without full employee acknowledgement from compliance, would automatically trigger an internal audit and freeze all transactions until reviewed by external authorities. It was a simple condition, but lethal if ignored. And of course it was ignored. The first time I saw the CEO's assistant override an access protocol to speed things up, I knew the system's integrity was in danger. They wanted the deal done fast, too fast. Corners were being cut, signatures pre-stamped, disclosures adjusted. So, I made sure Clause 17B was woven so deeply into the architecture that no one could remove it without dismantling the system itself. They thought it was a technicality. I knew it was a tripwire. As weeks passed, my inbox filled with urgent revisions, all marked with that same patronizing tone. The executives treated me like an obstacle, not a guardian of legality, and I accepted it. I played my role, quiet, compliant, invisible. Until the bonus meeting. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. My bonus wasn't performance-based. It was a contractual acknowledgement tied to successful closure of the merger's compliance framework, something they couldn't legally complete without my system's certification. Denying it meant one thing. They thought they could take the credit and erase my contribution. They underestimated how closely I'd been watching them. 2 days before signing, I noticed a minor but critical detail. The executive committee had quietly overridden the compliance acknowledgement phase in the merger software. The system flagged it, but I kept silent. I didn't block it. I didn't fix it. I just let it happen. Because that override was exactly what Clause 17B was designed to catch. That's why at 11:58 a.m. on the day of the signing, the entire system locked down. The compliance acknowledgement, they skipped. My acknowledgement was the missing piece. Without it, the merger wasn't just incomplete, it was invalid. As chaos erupted that morning, I kept my eyes on the reflection in the glass wall. Executives running in every direction, shouting into phones, trying to make sense of the red warnings flashing across the screens. It was poetic, a symphony of panic playing to the rhythm of their own arrogance. And I sat there still calm, watching the empire that dismissed me crumble under the weight of a clause they never cared to read. It wasn't sabotage. It was compliance, just doing its job. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, because a $650 million deal doesn't die quietly, and the people who lost it weren't going to let me walk away without a fight. By the time I returned to my desk that afternoon, the building felt like a pressure cooker. The merger signing was officially suspended, and whispers flooded every corridor. Screens that once displayed celebratory countdowns now blinked with system. Alerts and internal memos marked urgent. The executive floor, usually sealed off behind layers of glass and security, had turned into a war zone of hushed arguments and slamming doors. I passed by them quietly, folder in hand, pretending to be just another employee avoiding trouble. But deep down, I knew what was coming. The hunt. They needed someone to blame. By 2 p.m., an email arrived in my inbox with a polite yet pointed subject line. Immediate review required, compliance oversight. Translation. You're our scapegoat. Inside, I could already hear raised voices, the CEO, the CFO, and a handful of senior attorneys trying to piece together how a single clause had crippled their billion-dollar dream. I walked in calmly, clutching my binder like a shield. Their faces turned toward me, as if I were the ghost of their failure. Do you have any idea what you've done? Barrington barked. His usually confident voice cracked around the edges. I didn't flinch. Yes, I said simply. I ensured the merger complied with federal regulations. Clause 17B was standard for data security acknowledgement. Standard? The CFO scoffed. You've cost us the biggest deal in company history. I placed the printed documents on the table. No, sir. The people who bypassed my system did that. I only built it to prevent unauthorized actions. You triggered it yourselves. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Their legal counsel, a young woman who had always treated me with quiet respect, spoke up carefully. She's right. The clause is valid. It was approved months ago and signed by both legal teams. Barrington's jaw tightened. Then remove it. She shook her head. We can't. It's locked under government compliance. Any tampering now would be seen as obstruction. The CEO looked at me then, not as an employee, but as a threat. Fix this, he hissed, or you'll never work in this industry again. There it was, the line they all eventually used when power slipped through their fingers, intimidation dressed as control. I met his gaze, calm and steady. You'll get your fix, I said, but it won't be what you expect. That night, while they scrambled to control the fallout, I began collecting evidence. Every email, every unauthorized access attempt, every internal memo that showed how they'd overridden security to push the merger through. I knew they'd try to erase me, rewrite the story so I became the incompetent auditor who cost them millions. So I built my own archive, encrypted, timestamped, stored off-site. A record of everything. The next morning, HR called me in for an internal review. Their tone was clinical, detached, rehearsed. They accused me of negligence, of embedding unapproved clauses without clearance. They called my work disruptive. I let them talk. I even signed the acknowledgement form for their so-called investigation, because every word they used, every false claim, became another piece of proof. When I left that room, I knew two things. One, I was officially being framed. Two, they had no idea that their cover-up attempt had just violated two federal compliance statutes, ones that automatically flagged when falsified documents were entered into the audit system, the same system I designed. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. As I walked back to my desk, I glanced at the digital clock on the wall. 4:03 p.m., the same time every afternoon. The compliance log synced with the external database, and when that happened today, every lie they'd written into my personnel report would go straight to the regulatory servers. Immutable, irreversible. They wanted a scapegoat. Instead, they'd just documented their own guilt. I packed my things slowly that evening, knowing my badge access would likely be revoked by morning. But I wasn't afraid, because the same arrogance that made them deny my bonus was now leading them straight into their own downfall. And this time, I wouldn't have to lift a finger. I just had to wait. And sometimes waiting is the sharpest form of revenge. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my access card already disabled. My reflection in the glass door looked calm, but inside a quiet storm brewed. They hadn't even waited a full day. The message was clear. I was out. Security escorted me upstairs, a performance meant to humiliate. As we walked past the open workspaces, I felt dozens of eyes on me. The whispers were immediate. She's the one who crashed the merger. She's the reason we lost everything. They didn't need evidence. They just needed a villain, and I fit the role perfectly. Quiet, meticulous, unseen. The kind of person no one would defend because they barely noticed her existence in the first place. HR met me with forced sympathy. It's unfortunate, they said, but the board has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. On what grounds? I asked, though I already knew the script. They exchanged glances. Non-compliance and procedural misconduct during merger preparation. I almost laughed. You mean the compliance clause that saved you from committing federal violations? They didn't respond. Instead, one of them slid a termination agreement across the table. It offered a modest severance in exchange for silence, a non-disclosure clause so dense it could bury me forever. I looked at it for a long time, then pushed it back. No signature, I said. No silence. That's when I saw it. A flicker of fear behind their professional smiles. They wanted this over quickly, quietly, but I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. As I left the building, I noticed a few employees watching, from behind glass walls, the same ones who used to smile politely at me in elevators. None of them said a word. Silence is contagious in corporate spaces. Loyalty only extends as far as paychecks do. That evening, my phone started buzzing nonstop. News outlets had already picked up the story. Merger collapse blamed on internal compliance failure. My name wasn't mentioned, but the description was unmistakable. An unnamed internal auditor, responsible for unauthorized clause interference. It was all over LinkedIn too. Anonymous leaks, Company insiders painting me as the reckless employee who cost everyone their bonuses, their promotions, their future. It was elegant, in a cruel way. They didn't need to destroy me legally. They just needed to bury my reputation. But what they didn't realize was that I had already seen this move coming. Every time they spoke to the press, every word they leaked internally, I documented it. Screenshots, recordings, metadata. My digital archive was growing faster than their lies. 3 days later, I received an email from an anonymous sender. "You didn't deserve what they did to you. Check your messages tomorrow morning." At first I thought it was spam, but the next day, a new message arrived, this time with attachments. Internal meeting recordings, voice clips, boardroom minutes, documents proving that Barrington and his team had intentionally overridden compliance warnings to rush the merger before quarterly reports were due. Someone inside had turned. I didn't know who it was yet, but it didn't matter. The truth was surfacing piece by piece, through the very network they once used to control narratives. I watched the recordings late into the night, the executives mocking the compliance department, bragging about how they'd fast-tracked the red tape. I paused on one clip where Barrington himself laughed. "Who's going to stop us? The auditors?" I stared at the screen and whispered, "Yes, she already did." They thought they'd ended my career, but what they didn't know was that the clause they called a mistake was just one part of the system I built. A system designed to monitor not just compliance breaches, but cover-ups. And by trying to silence me, they'd triggered the second failsafe. Somewhere deep in their digital infrastructure, my system was still alive, quietly logging, recording, and sending encrypted reports to the regulatory archive. Every deleted file, every falsified statement, every internal correction. They had fired me to save themselves. But in doing so, they had given my system full, unrestricted access, because no one bothered to revoke my credentials in the regulatory environment. Their betrayal had officially backfired. They took my job, my name, my reputation. But what they didn't realize was that they had just handed me their confession on a silver platter, and I was done staying quiet. The night I decided to fight back wasn't a moment of rage. It was strangely calm, like watching the tide turn after a long storm. I sat alone at my small apartment desk, surrounded by folders, flash drives, and one open laptop displaying lines of code and encrypted logs. The city lights flickered outside, each one a reminder of the empire that had tried to erase me. They thought firing me was the end, but in truth, it gave me the freedom to move without restriction. The compliance system I built wasn't just a corporate tool, it was my insurance policy. Every action taken in the merger's database was mirrored to a hidden node, an external archive I'd built during long nights of frustration and paranoia. It wasn't hacking. It was documentation. Legal, automated, and traceable. And now it was my weapon. I started by compiling a simple file. Merger integrity report, private, copy. Inside it were records of every unauthorized override, every concealed clause edit, and every meeting transcript that hinted at financial manipulation. It was a complete autopsy of corporate arrogance. But I didn't stop there. I added a time-stamped sequence, showing how Barrington and his executives had forced early approvals to inflate quarterly performance, how they planned to announce the merger before final regulatory clearance, using inflated projections to manipulate stock value. I connected it all, emails, signatures, timestamps, document hashes, a digital map of deceit, and then I gave it a name, Project Mirror, because for every lie they told, I'd built a reflection of the truth. The next step was distribution. I couldn't just dump everything online. It had to be strategic, timed, and believable. I reached out to an investigative journalist whose work I'd followed for years, someone known for taking down corporations with cold precision. I didn't use my real name. I became Arya, an anonymous insider, claiming to have documentation of merger malpractice, with federal implications. It didn't take long for her to respond. Within hours, she replied with a single encrypted link and a message. "If what you're saying is true, this will shake the market. Upload everything." I hesitated only once. My finger hovered over the enter key as I thought about the life I'd built, the stability, the career, the quiet anonymity. All of it was already gone, so I pressed send. The files began to upload, slowly, methodically, like a countdown. But the real strike wouldn't come from the press. The true explosion was hidden in the system itself. Remember the automated compliance sync that triggered every day at 4:03 p.m.? I had modified it before my termination, just slightly. Now, whenever the executives tried to access merger data, the system would auto-forward a full compliance log to federal authorities. And because they had already falsified reports, the system's checksum validations would flag them as intentional tampering. In other words, every lie they told to bury me would become the evidence that buried them. The following morning, I woke up to chaos. News outlets everywhere were running the same headline. Whistleblower leak questions. Legitimacy of 650 mailers manufacturing merger. Barrington's face flashed across the screen. Tired, defensive, cornered. "These allegations are baseless," he said to the cameras. "A disgruntled employee is spreading misinformation." But as he spoke, the journalist I had contacted released the first batch of evidence. Signed emails, voice recordings, transaction logs, each one undeniable. By noon, federal regulators had officially opened an investigation. The company's stock plummeted 32% in hours, and me? I was invisible again, but this time by choice. Watching from the shadows as the men who stole my work tried to explain their own signatures to a room full of investigators. The board had fired me to protect themselves. Instead, I had become their ghost, the unseen auditor haunting their every file, every email, every sleepless night. Revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't fiery. It was quiet, methodical, permanent. And it had only just begun. The morning it all imploded felt eerily familiar. The same tense stillness as that day the merger froze, only this time it wasn't a technical glitch. It was the system fighting back. At 11:37 a.m., federal investigators walked through the company's glass doors. Not quietly, with badges out and cameras trailing behind. They moved straight to the executive floor, where the same boardroom that once echoed with power now filled with panic. I wasn't there physically, but I didn't need to be. The entire building's security feeds were automatically archived to my cloud. One last feature of the system they'd never noticed. Emails poured in from former colleagues. Some were terrified. Some were gloating. All of them said the same thing. They're seizing everything. Barrington's voice appeared on a leaked conference call within the hour. Frantic. Cornered. Who leaked this? Who still has access? The CFO stammered something about my name, but Barrington cut him off. "She's nothing. She's gone. Find the breach." They never realized the breach was them. Every word they spoke, every desperate cover-up email, was feeding straight into the evidence database. The more they scrambled, the deeper they dug their hole. By noon, the official statement hit the press. Regulatory audit confirms illegal documentation and data falsification during 6 and 15 merger process. The company's shares crashed live on air. Reporters surrounded the front gates, shouting questions that Barrington couldn't answer. He stood in front of the cameras again, eyes hollow, voice breaking under the weight of lies collapsing faster than the stock price. I sat on my balcony, coffee in hand, watching the world finally see the truth. My laptop pinged softly, a message from the journalist. "It's done. You were right about everything." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Then another email arrived, this time from someone I didn't expect, the young legal counsel who once defended me in that boardroom. "I thought you should know. The regulators found your clause. They called it the most airtight compliance safeguard they've ever seen. You didn't destroy the merger. You saved the law." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not the triumphant kind, but the kind that comes when the storm finally passes, and you realize you survived every part of it. At exactly 12:09 p.m., the same hour they once toasted to their unstoppable future, Barrington was escorted out of the building in silence. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. The man who said I'd never work in this industry again couldn't even meet the eyes of the people who used to fear him. By noon, their empire didn't just fall. It vanished. And all I did was hold up a mirror. Weeks passed, but the headlines didn't fade. Every day, new details surfaced. Emails, forged reports, offshore transfers. Barrington's empire unraveled thread by thread, until nothing was left but lawsuits and silence. I watched from a distance, no longer angry, just strangely detached. Revenge hadn't given me peace. It had simply restored balance. What they took from me was never about money. It was dignity, recognition, truth. And now, every broadcast, every public statement was an acknowledgement of what they'd tried to bury. The journalist reached out again, asking if I wanted to go public. She offered anonymity, protection, even compensation for my story. But I declined. I didn't want fame. I didn't want credit. I just wanted closure. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. One afternoon, an email appeared from the Office of Federal Compliance, a formal invitation to consult on corporate ethics reforms. They had traced the origin of Clause 17B and wanted to integrate similar safeguards nationwide. I stared at the message for a long time, the irony almost poetic. The same code they mocked was now being used as a model for integrity. I accepted quietly. On my first day in the new office, the air felt lighter. No politics, no manipulation, just purpose. My ID badge clicked at the door, and for the first time in months, I felt welcome again. Later that week, I came across a small article buried deep in the financial section. Former CEO of Barrington Group faces lifetime. Banned for corporate misconduct. No photos, no drama, just a line that ended a legacy. I closed my laptop slowly. Justice rarely arrives in grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet, a signature, a revoked title, a system rebuilt stronger than before. That night, as I left the building, the city lights shimmered on the glass towers around me. Somewhere out there, the people who once called me a liability were watching their own reputations crumble. And I had become something they never expected. A name whispered in respect, not fear. Not the villain of their story, the author of its ending. When the chaos settled, I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way people imagine revenge feels. There was no parade, no applause, just silence. The kind that makes you realize how much noise the injustice had made in your head. The merger's ruins became headlines for months. Analysts dissecting what went wrong, completely unaware that it all began with a denied bonus and a woman, tired of being underestimated. Horizon's name was permanently associated with failure. Stock tanked, leadership resigned, and the new board quietly reached out to me with an offer to consult on rebuilding trust. I refused. Some things aren't worth repairing. Instead, I started my own compliance firm, one that protects people like me, those who speak up and get silenced for it. And soon, the same corporations that once ignored my voice began paying to hear it. There's something poetic about that, turning the very system that broke you into one that now depends on you to survive. I never told anyone the full story behind that day, not the reporters, not even my closest colleagues, because some victories don't need witnesses, they just need peace. And when I finally sat in my own glass office, the afternoon light spilling across the desk, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because they'd finally learned that integrity isn't a checkbox in a compliance report. It's a mirror, and when it shatters, no amount of mergers or money can hide the cracks. I looked at the framed photo of my old ID badge, a silent reminder of who I was before the storm, and whispered to myself, they denied my bonus, but I denied them everything they stood for. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was restoration, balance. The world has a way of folding in on its own lies. You just have to be patient enough to let gravity do its work. Because sometimes karma doesn't roar. It whispers through balance sheets and boardroom silence. This is Revenge Untold, where power meets its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.